At the far western edge of Europe, where land gives way to ocean, Ireland is not as alone as it seems. In the salt air of the Atlantic, in bones older than written memory, Ireland quietly shares something with Spain and Portugal. Not myth, not romance, but inheritance. Tonight we follow the long shoreline of DNA where the sea remembered before history did. The Atlantic Ocean was never a barrier. It was a road. Long before borders, long before nations, people moved by water. From the Iberian Peninsula to the western edge of Ireland, the same ocean currents carried boats, ideas, and bloodlines. This is not a story of invasion. It is a story of circulation. A shared edge of the world producing a shared human memory. Chapter 1. The Atlantic Facade. Archaeologists call it the Atlantic Facade. Not a nation, not a culture in the modern sense, but a living corridor of coastline shaped by water more than land. It stretches in a long, unbroken sweep from the sun-warmed shores of Portugal, up through the rugged Atlantic edge of Spain, past the western face of France, into Britain, and finally to Ireland, standing like a last outpost against the open ocean. This facade was never meant to be still. It was shaped by currents, by prevailing winds, by the quiet mathematics of tides that repeat themselves across centuries. Along this edge of Europe, the sea was closer than the interior. Water was easier than roads. Boats were faster than feet. For the people who lived here, movement inland was slow, fragmented by forests, mountains, and rivers. But movement along the coast was fluid, predictable, shared. Communities facing the Atlantic were often more connected to distant shores across the water than to neighbors only a short distance inland. A fisherman in what is now Western Ireland had more in common with a sailor from Galicia than with a farmer deep in the European interior. They watched the same skies, they learned the same winds, they feared the same storms, they traded by sea, copper, tin, amber, salt, stone tools, ideas. Trade was not occasional, it was rhythmic, seasonal, built into the calendar of survival. They intermarried by sea. Boats did not only carry goods, they carried people. Families formed across coastlines. Bloodlines crossed water without hesitation. Children were born with ancestry that did not belong to a single shore. They spread culture by tide and wind. Burial customs, ritual objects, monument styles, ways of marking the dead and honoring the living. The Atlantic Facade developed its own quiet continuity, a shared coastal identity that long predated nations, languages, or written history. DNA reflects this reality. Modern genetic analysis does not romanticize. It measures, it compares, it traces patterns left behind by thousands of small, ordinary movements rather than a single dramatic migration. Again and again, genetic studies show the same result. Irish populations cluster more closely with northwestern Spain and western Portugal than with Central or Eastern Europe. This is not symbolic, it is statistical. It appears in autosomal DNA, it appears in Y chromosome lineages, it appears in maternal markers passed quietly from mother to child. The genetic similarity follows the coastline, not political borders. It mirrors the shape of the Atlantic facade itself, as if the sea drew the map long before humans tried to. The ocean did not separate these people. It did not isolate Ireland at the edge of the world. It did not sever connection. It braided them together. Wave after wave, generation after generation, the Atlantic acted not as a wall, but as a memory keeper, preserving ancient links between lands that still face each other across the same restless water. Chapter 2. The 1B thread. One genetic marker appears again and again along this Atlantic rim, not in fragments, not as a faint trace, but as a dominant signature, woven deeply into the male lineages of the western edge of Europe. It is found in bones pulled from ancient graves. It is found in modern DNA tests. It survives conquest, language shifts, and cultural collapse. The Y chromosome haplogroup known as R1b, specifically R1bM269. This marker is not rare, it is overwhelming. In Ireland, it accounts for the majority of male ancestry. In many regions, it reaches levels unmatched almost anywhere else in the world. The same pattern appears along the Atlantic coast of Spain, particularly in Galicia and the north. It appears again in western and northern Portugal. Different landscapes, different histories, the same genetic thread. This is not coincidence. Genetics does not repeat itself by accident on this scale. When a single lineage dominates across distant coastlines, it points to sustained movement, successful expansion, and long-term settlement. R1BM269 expanded westward during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, a time when Europe itself was being quietly reshaped. This was not a sudden invasion, it was not an empire. It was a slow, decisive spread of people who thrived along water routes. They followed coastlines, they moved along rivers, they settled islands. Maritime populations who understood the sea not as a threat, but as infrastructure. Boats allowed families to move. Fishing supported settlement. Trade rewarded navigation. These conditions favored certain lineages over time. R1B did not simply arrive. It endured, it multiplied. It replaced older male lines through generations of continuity rather than violence alone. In Ireland, this lineage did not appear as an isolated event. There is no genetic cliff, no sudden rupture that suggests Ireland was seeded separately from the rest of Atlantic Europe. Instead, the data shows flow. Ireland received this DNA as part of a wider Atlantic movement, linked genetically and chronologically to Iberia and the western seaboard of Europe. The same expansion that reshaped Spain and Portugal also reshaped Ireland. The sea carried it. The coast sustained it. Time preserved it. What survives today in Irish male ancestry is not a local anomaly, but a shared Atlantic inheritance. A single thread running quietly through thousands of years, binding distant shores into one ancient story. Chapter 3. The Bell Beaker Shadow. Then came the Bell Beaker culture. Not announced by banners or chronicles, not remembered by names or legends, but leaving behind a pattern that archaeology and genetics can still recognize in silence. The Bell Beaker people are not defined by a single language, a unified tribe, or a shared mythology. They are recognized instead by what they left behind: distinctive bell-shaped pottery, carefully crafted and widely shared, burial practices that followed recognizable rules, graves arranged with intention, objects placed with the dead as if meaning mattered beyond life, and beneath it all, a genetic signature that traveled faster than stories ever could. Around 4,000 years ago, during the early Bronze Age, Bell Beaker communities spread with remarkable speed along the Atlantic coast of Europe. They did not push inland first, they followed the sea. From Iberia, through the western edge of France, into Britain, and across the water to Ireland. This was not a slow drift, it was a decisive movement. Genetic evidence reveals that when Bell Beaker ancestry reached Ireland, it did not simply blend quietly into the existing population, it reshaped it. Within a relatively short span of time, a large proportion of Ireland's earlier Neolithic male lineages were replaced, not erased from memory, but overtaken genetically by a new dominant ancestry linked closely to Atlantic Europe and Iberia in particular. This is not speculation. Ancient DNA extracted from Irish burials before and after the Bell Beaker period shows a clear genetic shift: a before and an after. The after carries strong Iberian-linked ancestry, shared with populations along Spain and Portugal's Atlantic coast. This ancestry did not disappear when the Bell Beaker artifacts faded. It did not vanish when cultures changed names. It stayed. Modern Irish DNA is largely descended from this Bronze Age Atlantic wave. Not from a single migration, but from a sustained period of settlement, family formation, and continuity across generations. The Bell Beaker shadow is long because it was foundational. Later cultures arrived. Languages shifted. Celtic speech took root. Medieval kingdoms rose and fell. But beneath all of that, the genetic structure remained largely intact, anchored in this earlier Atlantic transformation. This is where myth often misleads. Irish identity is frequently explained through Celtic arrival stories, heroic invasions, or medieval origin tales. But the core of Irish ancestry predates those narratives. It belongs to the Bronze Age, to boats crossing the Atlantic facade, to people who carried pottery, burial customs, and bloodlines from Iberia to Ireland long before history learned how to write itself. This is not Celtic myth, not medieval legend. It is measurable inheritance, encoded in bone, preserved in DNA, a shadow cast by the Bell Beaker world that still falls quietly across Ireland today. Chapter 4. Dark Hair and Old Stories. Irish stereotypes forget something important. They freeze a people in time. They reduce complexity to a single image. Fair hair, light eyes. A narrow idea of what Ireland is meant to look like. But older Ireland tells a quieter, different story. Before modern mixing, before industrial migration, before mass movement reshaped Europe, Ireland held a notable population with darker hair and darker eyes, especially along the western coast, where the land leans hardest into the Atlantic wind. This was not unusual, it was not rare, it was simply normal for coastal Ireland. The same pattern appears again across the water. In Galicia, along Spain's Atlantic edge, dark hair and deep-set eyes were common and enduring. In northern Portugal, facing the same ocean, shaped by the same storms, the same features persisted. Different languages, different later histories, the same underlying human continuity. These traits did not appear suddenly. They were not imported by recent contact. They belonged to populations that had lived along the Atlantic facade for thousands of years. Physical traits are not proof on, are not their own. Hair color shifts, eye color adapts. Environment and chance play their roles. But when physical patterns align with genetic evidence, with documented migration routes, and with archaeological continuity, they begin to matter. Not loudly, not dramatically. They whisper instead of shout. They suggest populations that did not vanish when new cultures arrived. They hint at ancestry that survived beneath language changes, beneath political borders, beneath later storytelling. The western coasts of Ireland preserved older patterns because they were peripheral, because they were harder to reach, because the sea both connected and protected them. Edge places remember longer. What endured here was not dominance, but continuity. The same Atlantic people shaped by salt air and long horizons, weathered by wind, marked by sea light, carrying features that reflected ancient movement rather than modern myth. These were not anomalies in an otherwise uniform Ireland. They were remnants of a deeper inheritance, one shared quietly with other Atlantic-facing lands. Ireland did not only look inward, it looked west. And in the faces along its coast, history lingered, unwritten but present, telling old stories through familiar eyes. Chapter 5. Language is not blood. Here is where myths are corrected. Because humans love simple stories. Clear origins, single arrivals, one people replacing another in neat lines. But ancestry does not work that way. Irish DNA does not come from Spain because Irish people are Spanish Celts. That idea confuses language with blood and culture with biology. Celtic languages did not create the Irish people. They arrived to a population that already existed. Celtic speech moved later, during the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, spreading through trade, prestige, and social dominance rather than through mass replacement. Language can move without blood. History is full of examples. Peoples adopt the tongue of traders, of elites, of power. Bloodlines remain, even as speech changes, and blood can move without language. Populations migrate, intermarry, and settle, while keeping older ways of speaking or adopting new ones over time. What Ireland shares with Iberia is far older than Celtic speech. It does not arrive with druids or warriors or heroic epics. It belongs to a deeper layer of ancestry, formed long before any Indo-European language reached the Atlantic edge. Older than Roman roads which carved order into the continent, older than written law, older than names we recognize. This shared inheritance is Atlantic ancestry, a pre-Indo-European foundation built by coastal peoples who navigated by stars, by currents, by memory rather than maps. Later cultures arrived and built upon this foundation. They layered language on top of blood, myth on top of memory, identity on top of continuity. But they did not erase what was already there. The sea came first, before tribes named themselves, before languages divided people, before borders hardened into lines. The Atlantic shaped movement, settlement, and survival. And beneath every later story Ireland tells, the older one remains, quiet, salt-stained, and patient, waiting to be heard. Chapter 6. Memory in the Margins. Edge lands preserve memory, not because they are stronger, but because they are overlooked. Not because they resist change, but because change arrives more slowly there. Islands, peninsulas, coastlines that face outward instead of inward. Places where empires hesitate, where armies arrive late if they arrive at all. These margins of Europe were never empty. They were simply less convenient to control. Ireland, Galicia, northern Portugal all occupied these outer edges, facing the Atlantic rather than the continent. They were connected by water but distant from power. When empires expanded, they moved along roads, through valleys, across fertile plains. They passed through Central Europe first. They settled there longest. They layered population on top of population, diluting older genetic patterns through repeated waves of movement and replacement. But the margins were different. Reaching them required effort. Crossing water, navigating cliffs, accepting distance. As a result, older populations endured longer here. Not untouched, not frozen in time, but less overwritten. Ireland retained genetic signatures that were common in Atlantic Europe before the continent reshaped itself again and again. Galicia did the same, northern Portugal as well. These regions absorbed newcomers, but they did not lose themselves. Each new layer settled on top of something ancient, rather than replacing it entirely. Genetics reflects this preservation. Where Central Europe shows complex mixing from multiple directions, the Atlantic margins show continuity. Lineages stretching back to the Bronze Age and beyond. What survived here was not dominance, not empire, not political influence. It was continuity. Families remaining near ancestral land. Coastal knowledge passed down quietly. Marriages formed within familiar rhythms of tide and season. The margins remembered because they were allowed to. They were spared the full weight of continental upheaval. Spared constant reorganization. Spared erasure disguised as progress. This is why the Atlantic edge still carries echoes that central regions lost. Not louder echoes. Older ones. Memory did not survive here as monuments or texts. It survived as people, as bloodlines, as genetic threads that endured simply by staying. At the edges of Europe, history moved slower. And because it did, something rare happened. The past was not replaced, it was carried forward. Ireland does not share DNA with Spain and Portugal because of conquest. It shares it because of proximity, movement, and the ancient logic of the sea. Before flags, before borders, before names, there was the Atlantic, and people who trusted it. And their blood still speaks quietly beneath modern identity. If you listen closely to ancestry, you begin to hear how little the ocean divides us. If this story stirred something familiar, like a memory you could not place, like this video and subscribe to Moonlight Whisper. Here, we follow the quiet truths history almost forgot.